Okay, Mike Edgerton back with you. This is going to be episode 2 with Rob Bleser. This is the Spiegel Grove edition. Rob, we're going to talk a little bit about the Spiegel Grove and kind of what your part was in that and some of the cool stuff that went on there.
Sure. Well, in the very beginning, there were a couple of individuals that had gotten together, members of the dive industry, that wanted a special wreck, something to attract divers and get some pressure off the reefs. And they sent Bill Harrigan out there to look ships over, and he picked the Spiegel Grove. And he did a great job of picking the largest ship to be sunk at the time. The downside was it was a ship that was designed to sink and still stay afloat.
Right.
So it had 110 ballast and fuel oil tanks in it. Much less, a landing ship dock is what it was. And a landing ship dock was designed to sink. The tailgate would go down. Hovercraft or other vessels would come in. They'd work on them. They'd send them back out. Or they'd deploy them as landing crafts or whatever. And they would sink down, deploy them, then bail the tanks back out. So we had a challenge in front of us, but I was I was kind of off to the side for most of the first 6.5, 7 years, and then I was asked by the Chamber of Commerce to look at some things, and we found that it was a Chamber of Commerce project at the time, and the Key Largo Chamber of Commerce, and we found that the ship was about to be taken back by creditors.
Oh, gotcha.
The yard that had it, etc. There's some things that didn't go down.
We're talking about the naval yard in Virginia, correct?
Yeah, it was a scrap yard / service yard.
Right. And
so Betty Brown and I negotiated with that yard to get it out of hock. We had 5 dive shops that provided, that signed with 2 or 3 banks, local banks, for a loan to cover that expense of getting that ship out of hock.
Gotcha.
And then we started the medallion program. Steve Frink was a very integral part of it.
I do remember that.
Yeah, Steve Frink was an integral part of starting the medallion program.
Raising
We
money.
were raising money so that we could continue on with the project.
Yes.
At that time, I also, Steve Frink threw me under the bus because we had a county commission meeting. And they said, we're not going to fund any more of this unless you have a designated project manager. And so he threw me under the bus. I got the job. But in 11 months, after almost 7 years and 11 months, we had the ship down here. But prior to that, right after 9/11, Ike Beal and I went to the ship to inspect it for diver safety, being both running the water emergency team and representing Key Largo Fire. And it was interesting, but we were in uniform going to the plane. They'd walk us up past all the TSA stuff, walk us right in. A couple of times we got put in first class, things like that. It was very nice to be honored that way a little bit right after 9/11.
Right.
But we went up there and we realized right away, this is going to be trouble for divers. We're going to have to close the lower below deck, below main deck, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what that one picture is that you have in front of you, is going there and marking the locations for where there would be torch cutout areas for escape if divers got into a particular area. And that's why when you see pictures of the Spiegel Grove, they have all of these 4 foot by 4 foot holes all over the sides and the upper decks, et cetera, because from the main deck above all those levels, we wanted it so divers could swim in and go right through a hole or do whatever and have it very, very safe.
Right.
We didn't start losing divers on the Spiegel Grove until they broke into some of our welds for the lower decks. But with that said, we got it down here. We got it down on time. And remember that it was a ship that was designed to sink and still stay afloat. We were only allowed, with some negotiations, to use explosives in the 2 engine rooms. And I had hired a naval architect and a marine engineer to decipher what tanks should be filled, when they should be filled, how it should all go in order to sink the ship, and then put the explosives in the engine rooms, because I didn't want all those personnel on the ship during that process of having any explosives on it. So
Let's talk about the ship. Let's talk about, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with a 510-foot coast. Is it a Coast Guard cutter?
no, naval.
Naval cutter.
No, naval LSD, landing ship dock.
Okay. It's got a big well deck, as he's speaking of. The hovercraft float into.
Landing
they
craft.
sink it. They float into it. We're talking about a massive, massive ship.
Massive ship, 90 feet wide, 510 feet long.
How many welders took to cut holes to roughly?
To cut those holes, we had.
And we're talking to sink the ship. Go ahead.
Yeah, what do we have? 2 or 3 different companies
Right.
that were doing the work to cut that stuff. In the meantime, we also had Upper Keys Marine and Tobo US that were involved with pumping and filling the tanks. And Chris Fleming and Frank Conklin had gone up when the ship first came into play and got to the yard.
Sure.
And they saw everything that was going to be happening, and they were getting stuff that they could for memorabilia, etc. And for his workshop, Chris got a small little metal desk, and he had it in his he brought it and put it in his tool shed.
From the Spiegel Grove. Right.
And that's important for later.
Right.
Because the reason the ship did what it did, and Turtle, we had meetings up in Norfolk, and we had a meeting here at the station, at the Killard station, with all of the people that were going to be involved. We had over 60 volunteers on the boat doing stuff. Dave Gow was in charge of safety. And we had, at that point, Monroe County owned the ship, so the chief officer, if you will, for incident command, the incident commander was George Garrett with Monroe County. But we were going by the process, and we had both the marine engineer and the naval architect on the ship.
Right.
And all the drawings and all the compartments, and they were filling the compartments as we went. The compartments, first of all, the ship had to be cleaned, all the PCBs. That's what had been taking so many years, and they couldn't figure out. There's some things that went on. So when we got it, we had to get all of those clean. We had to get the PCB wires out, remove all the wiring in the ship, had to make it so that if it landed upright, it still cleared 40 feet of water above it. And if it landed on its side, it still had to clear 40 feet above it, et cetera, et cetera. So we had all those kind of things we had to deal with. And there were 3 things that were going to keep the ship afloat. Because remember, the well deck had to submerge.
Right.
So water
It had to go down first.
It had to go down first, and the ship had to stop.
Below the well deck, there were ballasts that were filling with water.
There were compartments.
Okay.
There were ballast tanks. There were oil tanks that all had been cleaned.
Right.
And there were 2 engine rooms. 2 engine rooms because the way the ship was designed, there was one engine was forward of the other. So if they took a torpedo, they could lose one engine room and still be okay, because they were watertight bulkheads in each and every section of the ship. So the fore engine room and the aft engine room were the multitude of the ballast, along with a series of ballast and fuel oil tanks up on the bow.
Right.
And the well deck was 277 feet deep. If I get my numbers right, I've forgotten so much of it. It's been so many years.
Yeah.
But way up underneath. And it went, you had the helicopter pad, you had the cranes, and then you had all the way up in there, the well deck went all the way to the bow. almost all the way to the bow.
Right.
So all of that had to be filled a certain way. And their science was perfect because the water started coming in early when they pulled the two rear hatches to fill that. The tank in front of that was a rudder room. It wasn't a tank. And then there was another ballast tank in front of that, and then the aft engine room.
Right.
And the water came in, but some holes were cut. We think the welders cut a little too big in the tank forward of the rudder room.
Gotcha.
And when the water came in, went through the rudder room, it went through those bigger holes and was moving so fast and filling up so quickly that the ship started to go faster than we thought.
Right. It was scheduled to go down, if I remember correctly, at 5 p.m.
1 p.m.
1 p.m. Okay,
Yeah.
I stand corrected. 1 p.m. And I remember being on the ship with you, and it was about 9 a.m.
9:30 when we pulled the rear
9:30.
hatches.
Right.
When the marine and engineer
We're
called
talking
for
a big variance there for
3
timing.
hours, a little bit of 3 hours.
Right.
Because we still had to put the bomb guys on. So pulled the hatches, water went in, it went in again, and then the ship stopped moving, and we had a mark in the we had spray painted a mark where the water needed to be for the next process of putting the bombs in.
Right.
And the water came up fast, and it came up fast and went, and it stopped right there.
Tell us about the bombs.
Well, we had two large intakes that were sealed for each engine room. Large, 36-inch intakes, seawater intakes. And they were sealed. So the bombs were going to be stripped around them, get the clearance that there were no dolphins or turtles or anything around, set those off, and the ship, the picture that you saw there, the ship like this, before it went too far, no, not that one, that's this one here. This was a little further than it should have gone. But that one right there, you can see it's just a little further down, but that's the way it was supposed to sit.
Right.
And it did, it stopped. And we, by the way, prior to, for every day, we were on there 4 days. Every day that we got on there, I had a meeting in the well deck, and a safety meeting, we'd talk about the muster locations, we'd talk about the alarms and sounding the alarm if something goes wrong. We had 62 people, I think, or 63. And everybody go about their business doing what they needed to do.
There were jobs. There were literal jobs going on at the time.
Everybody was doing welders and cutters and people doing a multitude of things. But they weren't just hanging around.
Right.
They were all there doing specific jobs.
Exactly.
And
Plus
a lot of those were welders and operators, pump operators, and hose movers for filling this tank, and removing this lid, and doing all. There was a lot of action going on. So when it started to go, it didn't even give us time to move the porta potty. The porta potty started floating, but it stopped, and we were lucky. Okay, that stuff was moving fast. Those holes in that tank were supposed to be 2 foot by 1 foot, and they were cut like 4 by 4, something like that, which was way too much in there. The
Too quickly.
bulkhead in the after engine room went, and found that out because one of the guys came running across and said, "Hey, I looked down the trunk space of the after engine room, and it is gushing water. There's water flowing into that after engine room." It was the after engine room that got lost. And that's when the ship, by the way, in the meetings, the engineer and the naval architect said there was a 1 in 6 chance we were going to land this ship. No, there was a 50% chance we were going to land it upright, and a 1 in 6 chance that it's going to roll. It's going to turtle. And when it lost that after engine room, and we got all 60 people, not a toenail was hurt.
That's right.
Everybody off the ship, including the county commissioner.
Right.
The ship went down, it hovered like that, it touched the bottom, and then because that 4 engine room was still good, and the forward tanks were still good, it came up, and it rolled over, and went upside down, and the one corner was touching.
Touching the seafloor.
It's touching the seafloor. And that's why it went. The point here is that for Chris Fleming, he comes to me within the week or so, because we worked on it for 3 weeks to get it down on the bottom. I volunteered boats. We had volunteer divers because the commercial divers couldn't dive that deep without getting into issues with recompression.
Right.
They had to sit with the rig. They were only allowed to do a 90-foot dive when we were going to 130 to run the hoses and all that stuff we were using nitrox. They couldn't use any nitrox. So Chris comes to me in the middle of that. He goes, "You're not going to believe what I found in that desk." The ship was decommissioned in 1989. There was a decommissioning letter. 1989, due to the lack of integrity of the watertight bulkheads, would have completely changed
the game.
Everything about what we were doing would have been completely changed if we'd have known that.
That's incredible.
But watertight bulkheads in the after engine room.
Breaking news.
Yeah,
Serious. This many years later.
That's many years
Would have
later.
been awesome.
Ship landed on its side, became an incredible dive on its side that many of us still believe was a better dive.
Mm-hmm.
But getting it over was a whole project in and of itself. Getting to go to the bottom. There's a great video that was on CNN of a quiescence boat throwing a line to the top guys on the keel that were drilling the holes and pulling them off in the 6 to 8 foot seas we had. It was wild.
I'll tell you something even more wild. I recall, and you're going to love this, I recall a phone call that was made after Hurricane, help me, Dennis. And that phone call came to you, if I'm speaking correctly, came to you and said, "Rob, we are out here at the coordinates of the Spiegel Grove, and the Grove is gone." What happened? Tell us what happened.
Well, they were actually out there to do mooring buoys, and then they finally found the one mooring buoy, and there was only one out of all the mooring buoys that were on there. There were 5 at the time, or 6.
The length of the ship.
And they could only see one. And the visibility was so bad after Hurricane Dennis, which did not even come here,
Right.
that they couldn't tell. And these guys, professional commercial divers,
Right.
and they couldn't tell what they were looking at because
Right.
the visibility was less than 10 feet.
Right.
And they kept saying, "We think this thing's upright." And I said, "Well, guys, I'm not interested in being fooled with," because that was the goal.
Absolutely.
And here, 3.5 years later, they said, "If you come out here and this ship isn't upright, we'll buy you a case of beer." And I said, "If I get out there and it's upright, I'm buying both of you guys a case of beer each." And got out there. By the time I got out there and dove it, I broke through and I knew every inch of the ship.
Mm-hmm.
I knew every inch of it. So I knew right away. Viz had increased by about 12 feet or something, so I had maybe 15 to 20, but I knew right away that the ship was upright. And what had happened, how it became upright, was that for 3.5 years, when the tugs that were hired to flip the thing from upside down to upright, the tugs used hawsers instead of cable. And the design was, we attached cables. We also took one of the anchors and brought it underneath the ship and rolled it up and attached it to the port prop shaft. And now we're talking about it's facing east. And the ship, and we ran that anchor, George Garrett and I and a couple other guys did it. We'd run that 8,000-pound anchor with lit bags. And we had a little hole. We go, okay, the lit bag's starting to get a little small. Whoosh, down it would go. Jump back in, go to 130 feet, refill the bag, get the anchor back up at the bottom, and go against the standard current to pull that anchor and that cable, it was a cable, tight enough, and set it down. So when the tugboats started to pull on the ship, they pulled to help roll it, and they also had lift bags. Paul Caputo, who was my business partner back in the day and is now deceased, took a spectacular picture of a 2,000-pound lift bag shooting 40 feet in the air. We've got it in the dive shop. Shooting like a rocket, because what they were doing was expanding down where they were attached. And they were attached to sections of the ship that were half-inch metal. And they would expand so much because they were starting to lift the ship. Because we were running air hoses, all those tanks that we had filled with water, we're now filling with air on one side to try to get it to roll. So those were all full. The bags were full, ready to pull. They pulled all night. They broke one line. Then they broke the second line. And then they grabbed the anchor chain and were trying to pull on the bow. And that's when they were drilling holes in the keel to get rid of the water, because they didn't know how much longer. I'm running the boat underneath that cable, and that thing was singing like a guitar string. They were pulling, this big tug was pulling on. And we got those guys off of there, and that thing went down, and we couldn't tell whether the ship was upside down. And the owner of the Resolve Marine Group, which we became friends over, Joe Carroll, and he said, he's talking to me on the radio, he said, Rob, what happens if this ship lands upside down? And I said, you lose and we lose, because part of the bargain in the contract was he had to get it on the bottom. And you lose and we lose, because we have 40 feet of clearance, 45 feet of clearance, in order to be able to be clear for the Coast Guard. And we had already done the figures that if it was upside down, it'd only have 25 foot of clearance. So it goes down, and after all the bubbles and everything quit going, and the ship, the ship was rolling and the boiling going on, and ran the boat over, and we put a diver off the platform. What do you see? What do you see? And he said, man, I've got Joe with me, the guys that we pulled, Joe and Frankie, and hell, man, this thing is upside down. And we went, just kidding, I can read Spiegel Grove on the side, right on the stern. And,
wow.
They lit cigars and everything. And it turned out to be a great dive, diving the props, doing everything. But the current would hit it for 3.5 years, dug a trench right behind it.
Oh, really?
Dug a trench.
Like a little gully from
a
that
gully.
current.
And when Hurricane Dennis went by, it went by below Cuba, but it pushed a shot of water. Cuba, the way it lays, you've got Cuba, Andros Island, the Queso Bank, and the Sanitarian Channel. It pushed right up the reef line. There were things that changed down in the lower Keys that people talked about, some of the reefs, and thing ran below the Tortugas. And the hurricane did. Pushed that wall of water, and because the current was already standard going from southwest to northeast, and you had the well deck like a cup, that current hit that thing, and the trench was there, and it went bloop, fell right in the trench.
Unbelievable amount of force.
And the anchor that we had put on was like a roll on the top. All those factors, and it landed in the trench. And when I went back and did a dive to see what the shape was and how the ship at the very stern is 88 feet. One corner read 98, and the other corner read 101. It was like a billiard table. From 88 feet, it was a 3-foot difference.
Wow.
And that's the way it sits today.
And I remember when that day happened, and those buoys went below the water line, and couldn't figure out where the Grove. They're driving around. They're looking for the buoys. We can't find the buoys.
Yeah.
They had, when it rolled, it had absolutely pulled those buoys underwater because it straightened the boat out.
The mooring lines, the mooring buoys,
correct,
were tied to the port side of the ship.
Right.
The port side was the highest part.
Correct.
But we had the water was shallower. Now, once it rolled, it was at 62 feet.
Right.
because it had a 12-foot ditch underneath it.
Right.
But we had at 48, it was laying in 48. 48 was perfect. And we had baby lobsters growing on it. We had whale sharks coming by it.
Wow.
We had all kinds of stuff happening because of the way the currents were working on it. It was a dive. It's still, it's a world-class dive even today.
Absolutely.
Because of all the growth and everything that's occurred with it. But so they wanted it to be the most famous ship, the Key Largo Chamber of Commerce. It was on the news for 3 weeks straight, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it became famous. Everybody came down to see it for 3.5 years. And now I got to see it upright. Everybody kept coming down.
Right.
So it was a win-win economically for Key Largo and for the community, the Upper Keys. Economic win.
Well, it's one of the growing YouTube search. You search the Spiegel Grove, and there are multiple dive people that have dove it and love it and just experiences. Yeah.
Yep. So that's the very short rundown of the history of how the ship came to be in Key Largo and how it ended up upside down.
And then right side up.
But not a lot of people know all the particulars of how it ended up upside down.
Yeah.
But that's what happened. And Chris Fleming, president of Key Largo Fire Department, had the letter in the desk.
Right. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember Ike Beal calling Frank and I and saying, yeah, we need security on that ship tonight. We can't.
You guys sat out there all night.
That's correct. We slept on the Spiegel Grove with Chris. Chris Fleming was out there with us, and we slept on the Spiegel Grove and made sure that no other boats were going to board it or anything.
Yeah, I'll remember that.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
So,
good stuff.
Well, Rob, thank you again.
I hope that was of value to you.
Absolutely, we appreciate it so much.
But that's how the Key Largo Fire Department got involved with it, was for water emergency and water safety.
Yep.
And we went up. I was up there 11 times. Ike went up with me a couple of times, but once I became the project manager after the fact, I was up there 11 times.
Wow.
Doing all
before
that
it was brought down with a tug from
before
Virginia.
Before it was allowed out of the. We had to get it moved to another yard, get it out of Hawk, get it moved to another yard.
Gotcha.
Do that. So.
Thank you so much, buddy. Appreciate it.
Thank you again.
Appreciate it, and we're gonna continue our series. There may be more. You never know. But we thank Rob Bleser for stopping in with us today, and appreciate you so much.
All right, Mike. Take care.
You bet.